Take the money and leave, my stepson said, sliding the contract across the polished oak table. You were never really part of this family anyway. I looked down at the paper, then back at him, and I smiled. At 68, I've learned that the most dangerous thing a person can do is underestimate a quiet woman. He thought he was buying me out. He had no idea who I really was. The room we sat in used to feel different. It was my late husband Daniel's study, the place where he handled everything, from business deals to quiet Sunday paperwork, while I brought him coffee in his favorite chipped mug. Now the shelves still held his books, the leather chair still creaked the same way, but the warmth was gone. In its place sat Ethan, his son from his first marriage, wearing a tailored suit that looked too stiff for someone who had never built anything with his own hands. He didn't look at the room the way I did. He didn't see the history. He saw assets. $50,000, he repeated, tapping the number with a manicured finger. It's more than fair. You walk away, we keep things clean, and everyone moves on. Clean. That word almost made me laugh. There is nothing clean about being erased from a life you helped build. But I didn't laugh. I didn't argue. I didn't even correct him. Instead, I picked up the pen he had placed carefully beside the contract, the way someone sets a trap and expects the prey to walk right into it. My hand didn't shake. That surprised even me. Maybe grief burns away fear, or maybe I had already crossed some invisible line weeks ago when I stood at Daniel's graveside and realized I was now alone in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. You should really consider this quickly, Ethan added, leaning back in his chair with the kind of confidence that only comes from thinking you already own the outcome. We're trying to move forward here. The house, the company, everything. It needs to be streamlined. Streamlined. Another word that meant something entirely different to him than it did to me. To him, it meant removing anything inconvenient. To me, it meant watching someone slowly dismantle a life piece by piece while pretending it was for the best. I turned the pen slowly between my fingers, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable, though he tried not to show it. He thought I was hesitating because I was weak, because I was overwhelmed, because I didn't understand. That was his second mistake. You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be, he said, his tone softening slightly, as if kindness now might seal the deal. It's a good offer. I nodded once, as if I were considering it. The truth was, I had already made my decision the moment he said I was never really part of the family. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because it told me exactly how far he was willing to go. And more importantly, how much he didn't know. I lowered my gaze to the contract again, scanning the lines he clearly believed I wouldn't read closely. Legal language has a rhythm to it, a pattern of control disguised as clarity. Daniel had once tried to explain it to me over dinner, years ago, laughing when I told him it all sounded like a different language. You don't need to worry about this stuff, he had said back then, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. I'll take care of everything. And he did. For 32 years, he took care of everything. But he also made sure I wasn't as unaware as people thought. That was something Ethan never understood. He saw me as the woman who hosted dinners, remembered birthdays, kept the house running quietly in the background. He never saw the conversations Daniel and I had late at night, the ones about the business, about protection, about what happens when people you trust start to change. Well, Ethan pressed, impatience slipping through the cracks now. Are we doing this? I looked up at him again, really looked this time. The same sharp jawline as his father, but none of the steadiness. The same eyes, but colder. There was ambition there, yes, but also something else, something rushed, something careless. Hadn't expected resistance, not even this quiet kind. It's all standard, he replied quickly. There's nothing complicated here. I'm sure there isn't, I said, still smiling. But I'd like to take my time. Time. That was the one thing he didn't want me to have. Because time is where mistakes reveal themselves. Time is where assumptions start to crack. And most importantly, time is where someone like me stops being underestimated. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the papers slightly closer to me, as if proximity might somehow force agreement. Fine, he said, but don't drag this out. We're on a schedule. Of course they were. People like Ethan always are. Always moving forward, always chasing the next step, never stopping long enough to notice what they're leaving behind, or who they're underestimating. I gathered the papers neatly, stacking them with care, the way I used to organize Daniel's files when he brought work home. Old habits don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment to matter again. I won't keep you waiting too long, I said, standing up slowly, steady and composed. He nodded, satisfied enough, already believing he had won. That was his third mistake. As I turned to leave the room, I paused for just a second, letting my hand rest on the back of Daniel's old chair. The leather was still warm from the sunlight coming through the window, just like it used to be. For a brief moment, I could almost hear his voice again, calm and certain. "Pay attention, Margaret," he used to say. "People always show you who they are. You just have to be willing to see it." I had seen it now. All of it. And as I walked out of that room with the contract in my hands, I realized something else just as clearly. Ethan thought he was buying me out of a life he believed was his. But he didn't understand the rules of the game he had just started. And he definitely didn't understand the woman he had just tried to remove from it. I did not go back to my bedroom after leaving Daniel's study. Instead, I walked straight into the kitchen, set the contract down on the marble counter, and stood there for a long moment without moving. The house was quiet in that heavy way it had been ever since the funeral, the kind of silence that presses in on you from every corner. For weeks, I had been drifting through it, making coffee I did not finish, folding laundry that no one else would wear, sitting in rooms that still felt like they belonged to someone else. But something had shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that I could feel it in the way my hands no longer trembled. Ethan thought he had given me a deadline. What he had really given me was a reason to start paying attention again. I picked up the contract and carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel and I used to sit every morning. He liked his coffee strong, almost bitter, and he always read the paper before saying a word. I used to tease him about it, telling him the world could wait 5 minutes, but he would just smile and say that details mattered, that the small things were usually where the truth hid. I sat down slowly and began to read. Not quickly, not nervously, but carefully, line by line, the way Daniel had taught me without ever calling it a lesson. At first glance, it looked exactly like what Ethan claimed it was. A clean buyout. A simple exchange. $50,000 in return for my full release of any claim to the house, the business, and all associated assets. But the longer I read, the more the language shifted. Not obvious, not careless, but deliberate. There were clauses buried deep in the document, phrases that stretched longer than they needed to, sections that referenced agreements I had never seen. It was not just a buyout. It was a complete surrender, not only of what I had, but of what I might have had. I traced one paragraph with my finger, reading it again, then a third time. Any current or future claims, whether known or unknown. That was not standard. That was protection. Not for me. For him. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. This was not just Ethan being impatient. This was Ethan being prepared, which meant he had been planning this longer than I realized. The thought did not make me angry. It made me curious, because planning requires information, and information comes from somewhere. My eyes drifted to the window above the sink, where the late afternoon light was beginning to soften. Daniel used to stand there sometimes, staring out into the yard like he was solving something in his head. I used to think he was just tired. Now I wondered how many things he had seen that I had not. The memory came back to me suddenly, not because I forced it, but because it had been waiting. It was about 5 years ago, maybe a little more. Ethan had come over for dinner, and something about the evening had felt off. He had asked more questions than usual, not about us, but about the company, about structure, about ownership. At the time, I had barely noticed. Daniel had answered calmly, redirecting when needed, never giving too much away. Later that night, after Ethan left, I had asked him if everything was all right. Daniel had paused, just for a second, before saying, "He is interested in things he does not fully understand yet." I remember laughing it off, telling him that was what younger people did. They were ambitious, curious. But Daniel had not laughed. He had just looked at me and said quietly, "Curiosity is not the problem. It is what people do with it." I folded my hands on the table now, staring at the contract again. Ethan had not suddenly become this person. He had been building toward this. And I had been too focused on keeping things peaceful to notice the pattern forming. I stood up, took the papers with me, and walked down the hallway to Daniel's office. I hesitated at the door, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The room still smelled faintly like his cologne, a subtle, clean scent that lingered longer than I expected. I moved to the desk and sat in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me. It felt different sitting here. Not because the chair had changed, but because I had. I opened the bottom drawer, the one Daniel always kept locked. After he passed, the lawyer had given me the key along with a stack of documents I had not yet gone through. At the time, it had felt overwhelming. Now, it felt necessary. The key slid in smoothly, and the lock clicked open with a quiet finality. Inside were folders, neatly arranged, labeled in Daniel's careful handwriting. Business accounts, property records, trust documents. I pulled out the last one and placed it on the desk in front of me. My name was on it. Not beside his. Not underneath. Mine. I stared at it for a long moment, then opened it slowly. The pages inside were dense, filled with legal language that once would have made me set it aside for another day. But not today. Today I read. Slowly. Carefully. And with every page, something became clearer. Daniel had not just taken care of everything. He had prepared for something. For a possibility he had never fully explained, but had quietly built protection against. The structure was layered, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Ownership did not sit where someone like Ethan would expect it to. Authority did not follow the obvious path. It circled back, again and again, until it rested somewhere he would never think to check. With me, I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on top of it, as if I could feel the weight of it through the cover. Ethan thought he was simplifying things, streamlining, removing complications. But he had stepped into something far more complex than he realized. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood why Daniel had never explained it outright. Because some things are not meant to be announced. They are meant to be discovered. At the right moment, I stood up, carrying the folder back to the desk where it belonged, and locked the drawer again. The click echoed softly in the room, steady and certain. When I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass of the bookshelf. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Not because she looked different, but because she stood differently. Straighter, calmer, as if something inside her had finally settled into place. Ethan thought I needed time to accept his offer. What I needed was time to understand what I already had. And now that I did, the contract on my kitchen table no longer looked like an exit. It looked like a mistake. Not mine. His. The next morning did not feel like the ones before it. For weeks, I had been waking up slowly, as if the weight of the house pressed down on me before I even opened my eyes. But this time I woke before the sun had fully risen. My mind already moving, already organizing thoughts that had been scattered just days ago. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house, and realized something simple but undeniable. I was no longer reacting. I was thinking. That changed everything. I got out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, moving with a kind of steadiness I had not felt in a long time. The contract still sat on the table where I had left it the night before, untouched, waiting. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black, just the way Daniel liked it, and carried it over, sitting down across from the papers as if they were a person I needed to understand. Because in a way they were. They represented Ethan's intentions, his assumptions, and most importantly, his blind spots. I picked up the top page again, not because I needed to reread it, but because I wanted to see if anything looked different now that I knew what to look for. And it did. The language that had seemed careful now felt rushed. The structure that looked solid now revealed gaps. It was not sloppy, but it was not complete either. It was built for someone who would skim, not someone who would study. That told me more about Ethan than anything he had said out loud. He did not think I would question it. He did not think I would look deeper. That was not arrogance alone. That was habit. He had been operating this way for a while. I set the paper down and reached for my phone, hesitating for just a second before dialing a number I had not used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, calm and measured. "This is Patricia Chun." I closed my eyes briefly, recognizing the same tone she had always had, steady, precise, the kind of voice that made you feel like nothing would slip past her. "Patricia, this is Margaret Collins." There was a short pause, then a shift, not dramatic, but enough to tell me she remembered. "Margaret, it has been a long time. I was very sorry to hear about Daniel." "Thank you," I said quietly. "I would not be calling if this was not important." "I understand," she replied. "What do you need?" I glanced down at the contract. Again, then toward the hallway that led to Daniel's office, as if the answer was somewhere between the two. "I need you to review a document. I said. And I need you to tell me what someone thinks they are doing. There was a brief silence on the other end, then a slight shift in her tone, sharper now, more focused. That sounds like something I can help with. When can you come in? Today, I said. As soon as possible. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from her in a glass-walled office that overlooked downtown, the city moving below us in a steady rhythm that felt far removed from the quiet tension of my own home. Patricia had not changed much. Her hair was shorter now, a few strands of gray at the temples, but her posture was the same, straight-backed, attentive, her eyes already scanning the contract I had placed in front of her before I had even finished sitting down. I did not speak while she read. I had learned that from Daniel. When you are asking someone to find the truth, you do not interrupt them. You let them work. The silence stretched for several minutes, broken only by the faint sound of pages turning and the distant murmur of traffic far below. Then she stopped. Not at the end, but somewhere in the middle. That was the first sign. She leaned back slightly, tapping the page once with her finger, then looked up at me with an expression that was not surprise, but recognition. This is not a simple buyout, she said. No, I replied calmly. It is not. She nodded once, then returned her attention to the document, this time reading more slowly, more deliberately, as if confirming something she already suspected. When she finished, she closed the folder and folded her hands neatly on top of it. Who gave this to you? She asked. My stepson, I said. He believes he is resolving an ownership issue. Her lips pressed together slightly, not in disapproval, but in calculation. He is attempting to eliminate your legal standing entirely, she said. Not just now, but in any future matter connected to the estate or the company. If you sign this, you are not simply walking away. You are removing yourself from any position of authority or claim permanently. I nodded, letting the words settle, even, though they did not shock me. And does he have the authority to do that? I asked. That was the question that mattered. Patricia's expression shifted again, just slightly, and this time there was something almost like interest in her eyes. She opened her drawer, pulled out a notepad, and began jotting down a few notes before answering. That depends on what he thinks he controls, she said, and what he actually controls. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Those are not the same thing, I said. No, she replied, meeting my gaze directly. They are not. She turned back to her notes, flipping through the pages of the contract again, then looked up once more. Tell me everything you know about the structure of your husband's assets, she said, especially anything that might not be obvious. I thought about the folder in Daniel's desk, about the layers, the way ownership circled back instead of moving forward in a straight line. I thought about the years I had spent beside him, listening more than speaking, absorbing more than I realized at the time. I think, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, that my husband anticipated something like this. Patricia held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, decisively. Then your stepson may have just made a very serious mistake, she said. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was being pushed out of something. I felt like I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. I did not rush to respond after Patricia's words settled between us. I let them sit there, steady and quiet, the way Daniel used to let important things breathe before acting on them. Outside the glass walls, the city continued as if nothing had changed, cars moving in neat lines, people crossing streets with purpose, but inside that office, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. What exactly do you need from me? I asked finally, my voice calm, measured, not because I was trying to sound strong, but because I no longer needed to sound anything at all. Patricia closed the contract and slid it slightly to the side, as if it no longer deserved to be at the center of the conversation. I need you to tell me everything your husband shared with you, even. The things that did not seem important at the time, she said. Details that felt routine, conversations that felt casual. Those are usually where the real structure is hidden. I nodded slowly, letting my mind move backward, not in a rush, but in a careful sequence, like opening drawers one at a time. Daniel had never been careless with information. He did not speak in long explanations, and he did not repeat himself. But he had always left traces. Small, deliberate ones. He never explained the structure directly, I said. But he would say things. Not instructions, not warnings exactly. More like reminders. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening. What kind of reminders? I rested my hands in my lap, thinking of the evenings when Daniel would come home later than usual, his tie loosened, his expression thoughtful but controlled. He would sit across from me at the kitchen table, not tired, but focused, as if something was still turning in his mind. He used to say that ownership is not always where it appears to be, I said quietly. That people look for control in obvious places, and that is why they miss it when it is somewhere else. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition. That sounds like layered trust structuring, she said, possibly with contingent authority. I did not need to understand every word she used. I understood the meaning. Daniel had not built something simple. He had built something protected. There is a trust, I added. Documents in his office. My name is on them. That made her pause, just for a second. Only your name? She asked. Yes. I watched as that information settled into her thinking, shifting the direction of her assumptions. That changes things, she said. Significantly. She reached for her notepad again, writing something down quickly, then looked back up at me with a steadiness that matched my own. If the trust is structured the way I think it is, your stepson may not have any actual authority over the assets he is trying to consolidate, she said. He may be operating under an assumption that was never true to begin with. I let that sink in, not as a victory, but as clarity. Ethan was not just aggressive. He was mistaken. And mistakes like that do not stay hidden for long once someone starts asking the right questions. He believes everything transfers to him, I said. That once Daniel passed, the control shifted automatically. Patricia shook her head slightly. That is a common assumption, she replied. But it is not always correct. Especially not with someone like your husband. From what you are describing, he did not leave things to chance. No, he did not. That realization settled into me with a quiet certainty that felt stronger than anything I had felt in weeks. Daniel had known something. Not necessarily about Ethan specifically, but about the possibility that someone might try to take control without understanding what they were stepping into. And he had prepared for that. Not loudly, not obviously, but thoroughly. What happens next? I asked. Patricia did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood up, walked over to a cabinet behind her desk, and pulled out a thin binder. She returned and placed it on the table between us, opening it to a section filled with tabs and highlighted notes. Next, we verify everything, she said. We confirm the structure of the trust, the ownership of the company, and the authority attached to each position. We do not assume anything. We do not react emotionally. We gather facts. I nodded once. That felt right. That felt familiar. And in the meantime? I asked. She looked at the contract again, then back at me. In the meantime, you do exactly what you have been doing, she said. You stay calm. You do not sign anything. And most importantly, you let him believe that you are still considering his offer. I felt a small shift inside me at those words. Not discomfort. Not hesitation. Something else. Understanding. You want him to continue, I said. Yes, she replied simply. Because people reveal the most when they think they are close to winning. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my coat, the movement automatic but grounding. For weeks, I had felt like I was being pushed out of my own life, like decisions were being made around me, past me, without my input. But now, for the first time, I could see the full shape of what was happening. Not just what Ethan was trying to do, but how he was doing it. And more importantly, what he did not know. I picked up the contract, holding it lightly, almost casually. I will not rush, I said. Patricia gave a small nod of approval. Good, she said. Because this is not something you want to win quickly. This is something you want to win completely. As I walked out of her office and back into the movement of the city, I realized something else just as clearly. Ethan believed he had already set the terms of this situation. He believed he had defined the timeline, the outcome, and the limits of what I could do. But he had overlooked one very important detail. He had never actually been in control. And now that I understood that, I did not feel like I needed to fight him. I just needed to let him keep going until the moment he realized exactly where he was standing. When I returned home that afternoon, the house no longer felt heavy in the same way it had before. The silence was still there, the same quiet rooms, the same sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors, but it no longer pressed against me. It waited. And for the first time, I understood that waiting could be a form of control. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and set the contract down beside it. Not carefully this time, not like something fragile, but like something I had already moved past. Then I walked down the hallway to Daniel's office again, opened the drawer, and took out the trust documents with a steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar in my own hands. I carried them back to the kitchen table, sat down, and began to read again, this time not as someone trying to understand, but as someone confirming what she already knew. The structure was exactly as Patricia had suspected. Layered, indirect, designed to appear simple on the surface while holding its true authority somewhere else entirely. There were names listed, entities connected, responsibilities assigned, but the control did not follow the obvious path. It looped, redirected, and ultimately settled in a place that required patience to see. With me, I rested my hand on the page for a moment, letting that settle fully, not as a surprise, but as a fact. Daniel had not left me vulnerable. He had left me protected in a way that only revealed itself when necessary. And now, it was necessary. My phone buzzed softly on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen and saw Ethan's name. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not out of hesitation, but because timing mattered now. "Margaret," he said as soon as I picked up, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. "I wanted to follow up on the agreement. Have you had a chance to review it?" I looked down at the papers in front of me, then out toward the backyard where the late afternoon light was beginning to fade. "I have," I said calmly. And he pressed. I could hear it clearly now. The expectation. The certainty that this was simply a step in a process he had already decided. "I have a few questions," I replied. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Not long, but enough. "What kind of questions?" he asked. I allowed a small silence of my own before answering, just long enough to remind him that this was no longer moving at his pace. "About the scope of the agreement," I said, "and the authority behind it." That changed something. I could feel it without seeing him. The shift was subtle, but real. "It is all standard," he said again, the same phrase he had used before, but this time it sounded slightly tighter, slightly more rehearsed. "There is nothing unusual there." "I am sure that is how it appears," I said evenly. "But I would still like clarification." Another pause. This one longer. "Then, we can go over it together," he said. "Come by the office tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. I almost smiled. He was trying to bring me back into his environment, onto his terms. That made sense. People like Ethan preferred control they could see. "That works," I said. "I will be there." When I hung up, I set the phone down gently and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle around me again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not empty, not uncertain, focused. I gathered the trust documents and returned them to Daniel's desk, locking the drawer with a soft click that felt final in a way I could not fully explain. Then I walked through the house slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see it again with clear eyes. The living room where we hosted dinners. The hallway lined with photographs. The small details that Ethan saw as assets, but that I knew as something else entirely. History, investment, time. None of those things could be measured in the way he believed, and none of them were as simple as he assumed. That evening, I made myself dinner for the first time in days. Nothing elaborate, just something warm, something steady. I sat at the table and ate slowly, not rushing, not distracted, just present in a way I had not allowed myself to be since Daniel passed. Grief was still there. It would not disappear simply because something else had taken its place, but it no longer filled the entire space. It shared it now with something else. Clarity. After dinner, I washed the dishes, dried them carefully, and set them back in their places. Small routines, but they mattered. They grounded me in a way that made everything else sharper. When I finally went upstairs, I paused at the doorway of the bedroom, looking at the empty side of the bed that still felt too large. For a moment, the weight of it returned, quiet and familiar. But it did not overwhelm me. It settled beside everything else I now understood. I changed, turned off the lights, and lay down, staring at the ceiling the way I had the night before. Only this time, my thoughts were not scattered. They moved in a straight line. Ethan believed tomorrow would be a continuation of what he started. Another step toward removing me, toward simplifying things in a way that benefited him. He believed I would come in uncertain, maybe hesitant, still trying to understand what was being offered. He believed I was behind him. That was his assumption. And assumptions, I had learned, were where people made their biggest mistakes. I closed my eyes slowly, letting the quiet settle in one last time before sleep. Tomorrow was not going to be what he expected. Not because I was going to confront him, not because I was going to raise my voice or refuse outright. That was not necessary. Tomorrow, I was simply going to sit across from him again, listen carefully, and let him continue believing exactly what he wanted to believe. Because the more certain he became, the more clearly he would reveal everything I needed to see. And by the time he realized what was actually happening, it would already be too late for him to change it. I arrived 5 minutes early the next morning, not because I was nervous, but because I had learned long ago that arriving early gives you time to observe. Ethan's office was on the 12th floor of a modern glass building, the kind that reflected the sky so perfectly it almost disappeared into it. Everything about it was clean, efficient, and carefully designed to project control. I stepped out of the elevator and walked into the reception area, where a young assistant greeted me with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Collins, he is expecting you," she said, standing quickly. "Please, go right in." Of course he was expecting me. Ethan liked things to move exactly as planned. I thanked her and walked down the hallway, my heels making a soft, steady sound against the polished floor. His office door was already open, another small signal that he was in charge here, that he was ready, that everything was proceeding exactly as he intended. He stood when I entered, offering a brief, controlled smile. "Margaret," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "I am glad you came." I returned the smile, just as controlled. "Of course," I said, taking my seat without hesitation. The office was larger than I expected, but not comfortable. The furniture was sharp, modern, chosen for appearance more than warmth. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, a view meant to impress, to remind anyone sitting where I was of the scale of what he believed he controlled. I placed the contract on the desk between us, aligning it neatly with the edge as I had seen Daniel do countless times. "I reviewed the document," I said calmly. "I have a few points I would like to go over." He nodded, sitting back in his chair, hands folded loosely in front of him. "That is what we are here for," he replied. "But I assure you, it is all very straightforward." Straightforward. That word again. I opened the folder slowly, not rushing, letting the silence stretch just enough to shift the rhythm of the room. "This clause," I said, tapping lightly on one section, regarding future claims. "It is quite broad." He leaned forward slightly, glancing at the page before responding. "It is standard protection," he said. "It ensures there are no complications later." "No complications for whom?" I asked, my tone still even, almost conversational. There was a pause. Brief, but noticeable. "For everyone involved," he answered, though this time the certainty in his voice was not as smooth as before. I nodded as if that satisfied me, then turned the page. "And here," I continued, "the transfer of authority. You are listed as the acting decision-maker." "Yes," he said quickly. "That is correct." I looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since I sat down. "Based on what structure?" I asked. That was the moment the room shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that someone passing by would notice. But I felt it. The small adjustment in his posture. The way his fingers pressed together slightly tighter. He had not expected that question. "The estate structure," he said after a second. "Everything transitions as outlined." I held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked back down at the document, as if considering his answer. "I see," I said softly. I did not challenge him. I did not correct him. I did not even hesitate long enough to suggest doubt. Instead, I turned another page and continued, asking small, precise questions, each one simple on the surface, each one requiring him to explain something he clearly believed was already settled. The more he spoke, the more I listened. Not just to his words, but to the spaces between them, to the things he assumed I would not notice. He explained the buyout again, the efficiency of it, the fairness of the amount, the benefit of avoiding complications. He spoke about moving forward, about streamlining operations, about making decisions quickly. And with every sentence, he revealed something else. Not about the contract. About himself. He was not verifying anything. He was repeating what he believed to be true. There is a difference. I let him finish, then closed the folder gently, resting my hands on top of it. "You seem very confident," I said. It was not a challenge. It was an observation. He leaned back again, relaxing slightly, as if the conversation had returned to familiar ground. I am, he replied. This is the cleanest way to handle everything. Clean. Efficient. Straightforward. The same words, repeated in different forms. I nodded slowly, as if I were beginning to agree. I understand your position, I said. And I appreciate the clarity. That surprised him. I saw it in the brief lift of his eyebrows, the way his shoulders eased just a fraction. He thought he was getting closer. That was exactly what I wanted. I picked up the pen he had placed on the desk, turning it lightly between my fingers, mirroring the moment from the day before. I will need a little more time, I said. But I believe we are close. Close. That was the word he needed to hear. How much time? He asked, leaning forward again, interest sharpening his tone. Not long, I replied. I want to review a few details thoroughly. That is all. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said. But I would prefer to finalize this by the end of the week. Of course he would. Pressure was part of his strategy. I understand, I said calmly. I stood up, gathering the folder, moving with the same steady pace I had maintained since I walked in. He stood as well, walking me toward the door. I think this is the right decision, he said, his voice carrying a note of reassurance now, as if he believed he was guiding me towards something beneficial. I paused at the doorway, turning slightly to face him. I am sure you do, I said, meeting his eyes one last time. Then I left. The hallway felt different as I walked back through it, not because it had changed, but because I had. The assistant looked up as I passed, offering the same polite smile, but I barely noticed. By the time I stepped back into the elevator, one thing was completely clear. Ethan believed this conversation had confirmed his position. He believed I was close to agreeing, that I simply needed time to accept what he had already decided. He believed he was in control of the outcome. And that belief was about to become his biggest mistake. I did not go home immediately after leaving Ethan's office. Instead, I walked slowly down the block, letting the city noise settle around me, the steady rhythm of traffic and distant voices blending into something almost calming. There was a time when this kind of movement would have overwhelmed me, when I would have wanted to retreat back into the quiet of the house, but now it served a different purpose. It gave me space to think clearly. Ethan believed the meeting had gone well. I could see it in the way he relaxed at the end, in the way his voice softened, in the quiet confidence that returned to him once I stopped asking questions. He thought I was aligning with him, that I was beginning to understand his plan. What he did not realize was that I had already moved past it. By the time I reached my car, my next step was already clear. I drove straight to Patricia's office again, not because I needed reassurance, but because I needed precision. She was expecting me. That told me she had been thinking too. How did it go? She asked as soon as I sat down. I placed the contract on her desk, then rested my hands calmly in my lap. He is certain, I said. More certain than before. Patricia nodded once, not surprised. That means he is comfortable, she replied. And comfortable people make assumptions. I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile. He believes I am close to signing, I added. Patricia leaned back slightly, considering that. Good, she said simply. That gives us room. She turned to her computer, pulling up documents, cross-referencing names, structures, and filings with a speed that made it clear she had already begun this process before I arrived. I watched quietly, not interrupting, letting her move through the information the way she needed to. After a few minutes, she turned the screen slightly toward me, pointing to a section filled with interconnected entities. This is what he is not seeing, she said. The ownership path does not lead where he thinks it does. I leaned forward slightly, studying the diagram. It was complex, but not confusing. Not anymore. I could see the pattern now, the same pattern Daniel had hinted at without ever laying it out directly. He believes control flows downward, I said. From Daniel to him. Yes, Patricia replied. But it does not. It redirects. It pauses. And then it resolves somewhere else entirely. She tapped the screen lightly. Here. My name sat there. Not prominently, not boldly, but firmly, connected in a way that could not be bypassed without unraveling the entire structure. I sat back slowly, letting that settle again, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. What do we do next? I asked. Patricia closed the file and turned fully toward me. We let him continue, she said. But we start closing doors he does not know exist. I nodded once. That made sense. What kind of doors? I asked. She reached for a folder on her desk and opened it, pulling out a series of documents that looked official, precise, and already prepared. Authorization controls, she said. Account access. Decision authority. We begin reinforcing the structure legally, making sure that every path he might try to use is already secured. I listened carefully, understanding more with each word. This was not about confrontation. It was about positioning, about ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no confusion about where control actually Saturday. Will he notice? I asked. Patricia shook her head slightly. Not immediately, she said. And by the time he does, it will be too late for him to adjust. That phrase settled into me with a quiet weight. Too late. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just final. I stood up slowly, smoothing my coat again, the movement familiar now, grounding. Then let us proceed, I said. Patricia gave a small nod, already reaching for her phone. I will start with the bank, she said. Then the corporate filings. Everything will be aligned by the end of the day. As I left her office for the second time that day, the city no longer felt like a place I needed to move through carefully. It felt structured, predictable, like something that followed rules, even if people inside it tried to bend them. When I returned home, the house greeted me the same way it always had, quiet, still, filled with memories that had not changed. But I moved through it differently now. I went straight to the kitchen, set my keys down, and stood for a moment, listening. Not for anything specific, just for the sense of it. Then I walked to Daniel's office once more, opened the drawer, and looked at the trust documents again, not because I needed to read them, but because I wanted to see them in their place. This was not something I had been given by accident. It had been built. Carefully. Intentionally. For a reason that was only now becoming clear. I closed the drawer and locked it, the sound steady, certain. Later that afternoon, my phone rang again. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering. Margaret, he said, his tone lighter now, almost confident. I wanted to check in. I assume everything is moving forward. I walked slowly into the living room, looking out at the backyard as I spoke. It is, I said calmly. I am reviewing everything carefully. Good, he replied. I think this will work out well for everyone. I paused for a brief moment before responding, just enough to let the words settle. I am sure you believe that, I said. There was a slight silence on the other end, but he recovered quickly. I do, he said. We are almost there. Almost. That word again. Yes, I replied softly. Almost. When I ended the call, I set the phone down and remained standing for a moment, looking out at the yard where Daniel used to spend hours tending to things that most people would not notice. Small adjustments. Quiet maintenance. Ensuring that everything held together the way it was supposed to. Ethan believed we were approaching the end of this process. That everything was aligning in his favor. That the final step was simply a matter of time. But what he did not understand was that the process had already shifted. The outcome had already been set in motion. And now, all that remained was to let him walk far enough into it that there would be no way back. The next 2 days passed without any visible change, and that was exactly the point. From the outside, everything appeared to move forward in the same steady, predictable way Ethan expected. I stayed home, kept my routine, answered his messages with the same calm tone, the same measured responses that suggested nothing had shifted beneath the surface. But underneath that stillness, things were already moving into place. Patricia worked quietly, efficiently, closing gaps that Ethan did not know existed. Bank authorizations were updated. Access permissions were reviewed and reinforced. Corporate records were aligned with the structure Daniel had designed, not the one Ethan assumed was in place. None of it made noise. None of it announced itself. That was the strength of it. Control does not need to be loud to be absolute. On the third morning, I woke to the same soft light filtering through the curtains, but there was a clarity to the day that had not been there before. I moved through the house with a steady rhythm, making coffee, opening windows, letting in the early air that carried the faint scent of spring. It felt like preparation, though for what, I did not need to name. My phone buzzed just after 9. A message from Ethan. Let us finalize this today. I have everything ready. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding immediately. He was accelerating. That told me everything I needed to know. He believed he was close enough to the outcome that pressure would seal it. He believed I was ready. I picked up the phone again and typed a short reply. 10 o'clock works. Simple. Desk. Everything is exactly as we discussed, he said. Clean. Final. Efficient. The same words, repeated again, but this time they carried a sense of conclusion, as if the outcome had already been decided. I looked down at the document, letting my eyes move over the pages one last time, not searching for anything new, but acknowledging the moment for what it was. Then I reached for the pen. I felt it in my hand, the same weight as before, the same smooth surface, the same expectation attached to it. Ethan leaned forward slightly, watching, not hiding it now, his anticipation clear. He thought this was the end, that this single motion would close everything. I lowered the pen toward the paper, letting it hover there for just a second, long enough for him to lean in just a fraction more. Then I stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough. I lifted my gaze and met his eyes. Before I sign, I said calmly, there is something I need you to clarify. The shift was immediate. Small, but undeniable, I said quietly. And in that moment, for the first time since this began, Ethan was no longer certain. For a moment, Ethan did not respond. Not because he did not hear me, but because he was recalculating. I could see it in the way his eyes shifted slightly, the way his posture, once relaxed and confident, became just a fraction more rigid. It was not panic. Not yet. But it was the first sign that something had moved outside of his expectations. There is no trust that affects this agreement, he said finally, his tone controlled, but no longer effortless. I did not interrupt him. I let the words settle, the way Daniel had always done when someone revealed more than they intended. Then I nodded once, slowly, as if I were considering his answer. I see, I said. I reached forward and turned the contract slightly, aligning it again, the movement calm, deliberate, almost absent-minded. Then I looked back up at him. That is interesting, I added. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms loosely, a gesture that might have looked casual to someone else, but to me, it was a shift into defense. What exactly are you suggesting? He asked. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now. Wait, the silence that followed was different from the others. It was heavier, more deliberate. He did not respond immediately this time. Instead, he studied me, really studied me, as if trying to determine whether I understood something I was not supposed to understand. That was the moment he began to realize that the conversation had changed. Where is this coming from? He asked finally. The question was simple, but it carried something else with it now. I said, but it is relevant to the authority behind it. That was the point he could not avoid. He leaned back again, but this time the movement was not controlled. It was reactive. Margaret, he said, his tone shifting, trying to regain the ground he had lost. I think you are overthinking this. I almost smiled, but I did not. It is accurate. Another silence. Longer this time. Then, we had an agreement, he said, the word agreement carrying more weight now, as if repeating it might make it real again. We had a discussion, I corrected gently. Those are not the same thing. I could feel the tension building on his end of the line, not explosive, but tightening, like something being pulled too far without release. I am trying to resolve this efficiently, he said. For both of us. I looked out the window, watching the light shift across the backyard, the same way Daniel used to, noticing things that did not change quickly, but changed steadily. Efficiency is not the same as accuracy, I said, but it was different now. Not uncertain, not waiting, certain. I walked down the hallway to Daniel's office once more, opening the drawer and looking at the documents again, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to see them clearly in this new context. Everything was exactly as it had been. The atmosphere was different. Subtly, but unmistakably. The assistant greeted me the same way, but her smile was tighter, more aware of something shifting beneath the surface. The door to his office was not open this time. It was closed. When she knocked and stepped aside, I entered without hesitation. Ethan was already seated, not by the window this time, but at his desk, papers spread out in front of him, his posture more rigid than before. He did not stand. He did not offer the same controlled welcome. He simply looked up. Margaret, he said, his voice even, but no longer smooth. We need to clarify this. I took my seat across from him, placing the folder on the desk with quiet precision. Yes, I said calmly. We do.